Greetings, and today I want to look at Cronos, a little game from Bloober Team, renowned for remaking that Silent Hill game that nobody probably has ever heard of, right? This is Cronos, The New Dawn, the game with the most unfortunately shaped helmet in all of gaming. But besides that, this review is going to be a bit more special, as it's maybe one of hopefully a series of reviews, particularly looking at Unreal Engine 5 games and taking a look at how the engine either supports or maybe even detracts from the game itself. Since I've stayed away from Unreal Engine 5 games due to their horrible reputation so far, I had not a lot of opportunities to get accustomed with the engine. But you cannot really make your mind up and judge something just by its cover unless you actually engage with the product and in this specific case, play the game. And thus, Cronos is now the third Unreal Engine 5 release that I'm honestly going to try. So far, I'm about 50-50. I'm 1 for 1, with Borderlands being the first Unreal Engine 5 game, which I absolutely hated, and then the second one being a Routine, which I quite liked. So again, currently 1 for 1 in the terms of Unreal Engine slop. Don't just expect me to make a generic Dead Space joke here, just because the game is inspired by it, and then make some dumb Unreal Engine slop comment and move on. Also, don't expect this review to just be a fart-huffing praise of how art house and special the story in this game is. There are already plenty of videos out there going into autistic detail about the story. You will get my honest opinion about the entirety of the game and my honest impressions of the gameplay, the graphics, the art style, and yes, the story, but without flowery and pretentious video essay nonsense. So let's see how well Cronos holds up. First, let's talk about the most important part, the base price of the game. Very important aspect. The game will cost you 59.99 euros or whatever your regional equivalent is. And this price is likely very much calculated, since Cronos is both a new IP and from a studio that up until the Silent Hill remaster was not known for making good combat-focused games. If you look into Bloober Team's past, some of their older releases actually have quite a bad reputation. Not only for their gameplay, but also for some of the storytelling aspects, which were not a high point of Bloober games. Bloober games' stories usually seem to suffer from budget constraints or time constraints when it came to the story, and they were usually very art house inspired, pretty good looking, interesting, surreal horror experiences that were mostly spooky walking simulators. I can recommend a YouTuber by the name MerdKK if you want to go into more detail, because she goes into absolutely excruciating detail on some of the Bloober Team games and their very inappropriate handling of topics such as mental illness, self-harm, and suicide, and so on and so forth. That being said, this might be one of the most competent Bloober Team games out there so far. I'm not counting Silent Hill because it's a remake. I would say that Bloober Team also got a little bit bold after that Silent Hill 2 success, thinking people would possibly fork over $60 for Cronos, and I don't think that paid off. Obviously, we're not talking about $80 or $70 here, so $60 is a little bit closer to acceptable, but I still think it is too high because the game evidently didn't sell too well, and I think this is in large part due to the unknown factor of the IP and the price. The IP is completely new. The studio has not really established themselves as a horror survival specialized powerhouse, and the price is honestly just a bit too high. Even after fully experiencing the game in New Game and New Game Plus and Hardcore mode, I think the asking price was set too high. Don't ask me about prices of modern video games and what's okay. Is a $50, $60, $70 price game okay? If I go into detail, the video is gonna never end. Let's just say that I think $60 for a game is mostly always too much money. Suffice to say, Cronos would have done a bit better if it would have been in the $30 to $40 range, and then maybe a little bit shorter. And this is also the price range where I would argue you can purchase Cronos without really thinking too much about it once it goes on like a 50% sale. But only do so if this review and other reviews actually pique your interest in the game. After all, this is your money and your time, and you should never waste it on products that are not worth the asking price. Let us now look at the performance and the graphics first. since it's one of the more important aspects of a review all about Unreal Engine 5 and how it plays with the game. Usually, gameplay would come first in every and all cases because gameplay is king, but let's make an exception here for this review specifically since it's all about Unreal Engine. The first impression that I got from Cronos were not too stellar, to say the least. The game wants you to install a very old version of Net Framework, version 3.5 to be exact. Now this version is actually from 2008. That does not mean it's actually that old. Naturally, it's receiving security updates all throughout the years, 2024 for example, and Microsoft will support this version until 2029. So it is not a security risk, but still a tiny bit questionable why a recently released Unreal Engine 5 game requires the installation of a rather old Net Framework version. Apparently that is the case with some other recent games as well, so therefore Cronos is not a terrible outlier, but it still comes across as a little bit odd. Then, sadly, the game seems to start in windowed mode without the mouse cursor being focused into the window. Thus, you're not able to skip all the intros and warning labels at the beginning. At first, I falsely assumed this was intended, but a quick tap in and back fixes the issue, and when you actively click into the window during the start of the game, the cursor might also likely work after some time. I personally had to alt-tab back and forth to skip the intros on numerous occasions when starting up this game. It's a little bit annoying, but this might also vary from person to person, and it might have been related to my 3-monitor setup, so that might literally be a me problem. The settings menu comes across as fairly competent. You will have to actively push the graphic settings all the way to the right to unlock the extended options, and naturally all the Unreal Engine 5 trademark performance features are here. You got the upscalers and you got frame gen, and none of these features I ever activated at any point in the game. Without extending the videos to 2 hours, let's just make it short, and I will just say that I think all of these performance features are poor band-aid solutions to a rather terrible trend of not actually stabilizing and optimizing games anymore. And thus, none of these features should ever be turned on if your rig meets the optimal requirements or exceeds them. It's a different story when you play this game with unoptimized hardware. That's of course a completely different story. But I'm running this game with completely and utterly overtuned hardware, so I should never have to turn on frame gen or upscaling technology. So at least we got a good settings menu, you know, that's something. Now the big question you are likely already screaming at me is, does this game have the signature Unreal Engine stutter? Yes, it does. Especially during the beginning levels of the game, there were some really mean and quite noticeable stutters, but, and listen closely now, I have to emphasize this here very, very specifically, but these stutters do not occur on a 5-minute interval. It's more likely every 30 minutes or so there is a slight stutter, and then I had about 3 severe stutters during the entire game. Most of them very early on and then way less later on in the game. Most of these stutters occurred during what seemed to be loading or transitional zones, and only very few happened just randomly. The game does indeed load shaders, and it does shader compile on every startup, the first compilation obviously taking a little bit longer. All in all, I assume the stuttering got way less later on in the game, since at that point there weren't really any more assets the game needed to load, and the game does also not have many huge and varied set pieces that would necessitate a severe in-game loading lag. Most of the game's levels take place in Eastern European style apartments, an hospital, an abbey, an underground facility, and a steel mill. The steel mill actually being the most interesting looking area in the game, so due to the game taking place in very cramped indoor environments, I wouldn't expect the game actually lagging due to shader cache loading or some other weird Unreal Engine shenanigans. The loading lag is present though. If that's an issue for you, then you know that yes, loading stutters do take place in the game, but it doesn't happen very often. But also keep in mind, my hardware that I'm running the game with is completely overblown. It's way past the recommended settings. So if you're running on lower end hardware, your mileage of the performance may vary quite a lot. Performance wise, the game does not And this is very important, it does not have any significant slowdowns during combat, and it also never had any stuttering that happened during a combat encounter. In general, the actual gameplay of Cronos, the combat-focused gameplay, was never negatively influenced by any stutters. Even when a stutter happened, there were never enemies or challenges, movement challenges present when it happened. It seems to be a pure loading and transitional stutter. I did have one singular Unreal Engine 5 related crash in the entirety of the game. So there's a singular crash, which is quite good for Unreal Engine 5 reputation. Speaking of runtime, the game will take you about 12 hours to complete on your first playthrough if you explore excessively like I usually do. That will be one important point when we talk about the gameplay later on. So far, this is all I have in terms of purely performance related complaints or findings. The game runs rather well as opposed to other Unreal Engine trash slop like Borderlands 4, for example. But now I would like to talk about the graphic aspects and fidelity of the game, and also how the gameplay is influenced by what I either see as restrictions of the engine or things that the dev team might not have been deemed valuable to include. It's mostly going to be immersion features that I will have complaints about. First, when talking about Unreal Engine 5, you expect a certain fidelity and visual appearance, and I have to be honest, I don't really see it. Besides the very detailed models on the weapons and the main character and some of the futuristic technology in the game, some of the other models and textures are rather minimalistic and sometimes even cheap looking. Especially the gore textures all over the walls have a rather low poly and sometimes almost untextured look to them. And certain areas in the game have either very poor texture work, or it seems the textures have not loaded at all. In addition, some of the human characters' facial animations have that weird wax-like uncanny valley look to them, which has become very iconic with the Unreal Engine 5 motion captured facial animations by now. At least this is supposed to be a horror game, so uncanny in this case is good. But I don't think this was intentional by the developers. The game also suffers from a fair bit of repetitive props and environmental design, with repeating rooms and similar objects appearing again and again. Same goes for some of the static enemy placements in the game that make traversal and encounters rather formulaic and expectable. I think I got surprised by exactly 2 scenarios of monsters breaking through doors, and that is about the only trick the game tries to play on you, jump scare wise at least. Most of the combat encounters or dangers from the environments are rather predictable and repetitive, and especially the traps, quote unquote traps, in this game are really obvious and overstay their welcome after a while due to their unimaginative placement. Going back to environmental detail here, the most impressive aspect of the engine is always the lighting, and here is the same story. The lighting and shadows look really well in the game and give it a much needed atmosphere. I was also impressed with the snowy version of one of the areas in the game. Here's a quick spoiler warning for you, so spoiler warning, parts of the stories are going to be revealed here. There is time travel in the game, and I really like that Eastern European apartment complex in the icy cold winter at night with totally abandoned streets and backyards. This was a really cool set piece, even though we were just kind of walking through it. It was a rather nice atmosphere. On the other hand though, you don't really seem to displace the heavy snow, and seemingly you also don't leave footsteps in the snow. It's a bit hard to tell, but I'm pretty sure they didn't include that aspect. You might argue that that's really not a big deal, but for such a high fidelity, detail-driven engine to not have these slight immersion features, why even use the engine to begin with? And it's just footsteps in the snow. It's nothing really important here. It's just a little bit of an immersive feature. I also think this game lacks interactability with the surrounding game world that other older engines just brought to the table. Hitting different objects does not produce different sounds most of the time. You cannot interact with props. You cannot run into like a trash can accidentally, or a ball, or knock something over, or drag something with you. Enemy corpses as well have barely any ragdoll, only really when they die and then they go completely stiff. Windows don't really react to being whacked with the melee. Only designated boxes can break when you hit them or when you stomp on them, and you cannot break down doors, even though some of the enemies seemingly can break through doors. Enemies only, however, break down doors that have been designated to be broken for an event to act as a jump scare. They never seemingly break through doors during combat scenarios. You also cannot destroy small props like the wooden barriers or wooden pallets, and none of the objects on tables, on racks or other stored items such as bottles and cleaning supplies can be flung when hit. They don't even give like a visual feedback when you smack them. There isn't even a scenario where there's at least something flying off a table when you hit it. There's lots of clutter in rooms, which is good. That gives it a more immersive feel, you know from software games, the more cluttered the room is, the better it looks. But then you can interact with anything because everything is made of concrete and it's glued to the table and to wherever it's sitting. I wouldn't even mind if the game was faking it, where it's like you get a visual effect, but none of the props actually move. But even that's missing. Like, again, we can't even accidentally bump into a chair. You know, it's all static. None of this can be moved around. Not even if it's obvious that the objects could be moved. Like if there's a stroller or a wheelchair that definitely has the capability of being wheeled around, you can't interact with anything. The world feels totally static unless you find a box with yellow paint. Then it can be broken. You can at least run into doors or push them and punch them open after you've actually unlocked the door. You can never actually shoot out locks or chains, and you can't punch through doors or kick them down, even though there is a punch and the kick in the game. And your guns also have absolutely no effect on small, weak wooden doors. You can shoot out barricades, you can shoot the barricaded doors and then destroy the barricades, but you can't actually destroy the doors, which is the same material. For anything besides these yellow painted barricades, you have to either use a key or a key card, or you need the bolt cutters, which is a dedicated item that you have to drag around in your inventory at all time to get to chained up doors. There is no way our protagonist could not just break through these weak glass doors in the hospital section, or just literally shoot doors open using the shotgun. And shooting at a chained up door feels natural in games like this. You sacrifice your ammunition to progress and unlock a room, but for some reason the game denies you that interactability and you need to use a specific tool for that. Same for car windows and other breakable things. Either the loot that you get just sits out in the open, or it's only ever found in yellow painted boxes or on a shelf, but you never punch out a car window or break open a locker and then you find loot in it. That just doesn't happen in the game. And even the most fragile props in the game are totally unmoving when you walk into them or when you stomp on them. Everything is made out of indestructible material unless it's painted yellow. This is especially disappointing with the explosive barrels and the fuel tanks. You can't kick them, you can't push them into place, you can't have them roll around. These are all static objects that you need to lure the monsters to in order to make use of them. The game severely lacks this physics-based interactions in almost all layers of the gameplay. The only things that have physics are the monsters. They have a quick ragdoll animation when you shoot them and they die, but then they go stiff on the floor. Mostly because their corpses need to stay put, because there's a game mechanic that has to do with corpses. So at least I have an understanding why this happens. But the rest of the game is purely made out of unmovable concrete. Like, it's actually set in stone. It's like you can't move anything in this game unless it is marked. In addition to that, movements feels very static too, and it's not in the sense that we are playing a character that is very heavily armored and they're moving clunky. No, that's not it. Most of the movement is bound to the interact button. What do I mean by this? Squeezing through a million little gaps, and you always roll the same looking obstacles out of the way, or you drag something out of the way which unveils an obvious gap in the wall or a door. You have to crouch under something only using the interact button. There isn't a dedicated crouching. Same goes for repositioning during a fight. You can't just hop off ledges by walking off of them. There is no jump. You need to interact with the ledge, and then you're always locked in this animation when you jump off or you climb up something. So much in this game is locked to static animations, and this game also does the thing that a lot of older titles did to mask loading screens. You push a heavy filing cabinet, and yes, it's always the same filing cabinet. You push that out of the way, and then that filing cabinet falls back into place after you have pushed past it. So every time you traverse this specific area, you have to push the same filing cabinet out of the way, and then it falls back into place. And the problem is, this is always done using the interact button and holding the interact button. And there isn't even a loading screen there to hide. So why is that specific type of interaction in the game in so many places, especially in the hospital? A lot of this is very immersion breaking. For a game that looks immersive and looks high fidelity on the surface, but then it lacks the actual features of an immersive and an advanced high-fidelity engine. That is what always irks me about most of these Unreal Engine 5 titles. They only look good on the surface, but their engagement and mechanical depth seemingly is as shallow as a puddle. A lot of this is down to probably Bloober Team not wanting to include these mechanics, because they're definitely possible with Unreal Engine. Because Silent Hill suffered from the same very restrictive interactability of the game world, where only specific glass doors could be smashed in and specific doors on windows or specific car windows could be broken down. And I guess Bloober Team does not find these features necessary to facilitate immersive gameplay. But I would have liked to have a little bit more physics gameplay in there. At least have the props not be glued to everything. But a lot of the very gamey aspects take you out of the experience again and again, such as the very convoluted place filling cabinets. You know, there's like the same cabinet or the same obstacle that is always in front of a door or a gap that you push through. And it's always the same number of yellow painted barricades that you need to punch out of the way to go through something. And only in very certain cases can you shoot these barricades. And then there is obviously the yellow painted boxes or the obvious wall gaps that separate seemingly certain game spaces, even though there isn't a loading screen there. And also let's talk about the RTX feature in this game while we're at it. When it is active, the game loses about 70 FPS in certain scenarios. With RTX on, I was running at about 90 FPS on, again, very beefy hardware. With it turned off, the game actually reached the refresh rate FPS of my monitor, so I was running at 180 FPS. Only sometimes though. The game usually runs at a solid 120 FPS, almost constantly, on the highest graphical settings without any upscaling or frame gen turned on. That's very important to mention here. It is not optimal and FPS in this game isn't too great, Unreal Engine 5 I guess, but at least 120 FPS is still acceptable. That at least should be the industry standard in the year of 2026. 60 FPS, by the way, is not and should never be considered acceptable or industry standard in any timeline at all. I'm sorry, but at least 120 FPS is what any modern games should aim for. So my opinion is just turn RTX off, because you barely notice a difference anyway. The animation lock on the punch and the stomp are also way slower than they need to be. The stomp has an extremely long, very noticeable pause in between every stomp, and the punch can only be used twice before the game locks you out of the animation. It wouldn't even be abusable, as most enemies, no enemies at all, actually get permanently staggered by the punch or the stomp. They actually only stagger once and then they just power through your punches. So it isn't really as effective as it could be, even though if even you could spam the stomp or spam the punch, it wouldn't do you anything good. So I'm kind of surprised that there is such a hard animation lock in there. Both also seem like a bit of an afterthought in the game. They only become useful when you upgrade their effective damage. Staggering using the punch or the stomp usually isn't a good idea. So the stomp, the punch are mostly used to open up chests or boxes. And then every now and then when an enemy is actually staggered by a weapon, then you can run up and stomp on them. But in 90% of all cases, I never had to do so because the stagger from your fire blast, your fire grenade, and your shotgun are way better stunning tools than any of your punches and kicks. Overall, the game does not really look like it's Unreal Engine worthy. Let's say I was whelmed, to say the least. I wasn't too impressed with the visual representation of the game. It looks fine, but it still absolutely gets shit on graphics-wise and physics-wise by much older titles such as Arkham Knight, Cyberpunk, or Metal Gear 5. I still fail to see the use of Unreal Engine, since this fidelity could have been achieved with the use of any other halfway modern engine as well. And with that, let's move on to the gameplay, which I've already talked about a little bit already, but we're just gonna move on to the full-on gameplay review. The gameplay is okay. In fact, this game is rather long, and it's not necessarily a strong point or an advantage for the game. The story, being the absolute strong suit of this game, gets stretched quite a bit in the final act, and the rather uneventful gameplay loop does not help the monotony. You play a slow and clunky, heavily armored character fighting abominations, just not on a space station. There are dedicated save points with an upgrade shop and storage and save stations. You come across playbacks and notes of other NPCs that tell you parts of the lore and story. The game has obvious dedicated combat arenas where the doors close, an alarm goes off, and you have to sanitize the area of hostiles before you can move on and the doors open again. You have a suit, which can be upgraded through the use of upgrade cores, and as you expect, health, inventory slots, and crafting item limits can be increased. Yes, the game has light crafting aspects with 2 types of resources that can be combined to make ammunition, grenades, fuel for your flame blast, and health kits. The compass works similar to Dead Space, and the UI is fairly minimal. The game sadly does not display the character stats on the back of their armor or somewhere in the game world. A little bit unfortunate, but it's doing a good job so far. Weapons are found throughout the game and upgraded using the currency of the game. Upgrading is done at shops, where you can also buy ammunition and so on if you need it by using the currency of the game. Resources are rather sparse, as expected, and inventory space is limited. Important quest items also take up inventory slots, such as keys, keycards, or the bolt cutters. Inventory items that are no longer needed are used up when you use them for the last time. For example, a keycard can open multiple doors. If you use the keycard on the largest possible door, the keycard will vanish. One exception are the bolt cutters. Those are useful all throughout the game to open doors that lead to, let's say, useful upgrades and secrets. But if an item that is used to open a door is vanishing from your inventory, that is a very good indicator for you to know that indeed that is the last door that this keycard has been capable of opening, which is a good decision. Important quest items and items of value that can be sold at shops also take up inventory slots. That includes fuses as well. So inventory management is absolute key in this game. However, I was basically constantly carrying around the bolt cutters, for example. So there's an inventory slot that was permanently reserved for the bolt cutters, and I never had a big issue with inventory space management. Maybe that's also because I instantly leveled the inventory up to max, which is what I also expect almost every player is going to do. Resources and resource management are the be-all and end-all for your survival in this game. Both max health and crafting item limits were less important than the inventory space, in my experience. I would argue that your health stat is actually the least important stat in the game. The availability of crafting items, health kits, and inventory space are way more important. You get a movement upgrade later on halfway through the game that enables you to walk on dedicated gravity platforms in order to traverse certain areas, and in the final boss fight, these platforms also serve as places to evade the boss's attacks. It would have been nice if these gravity platforms also had certain uses in other combat scenarios and encounters in the rest of the game, but that isn't really the case. They're mostly there for very cinematic traversal. And also, as you probably will get to know through the story, you can harvest human essences. Let's just keep it at that. And each of them gives you passive upgrades, such as your punch doing more damage, which is actually kind of good, or shotguns doing more damage when hitting multiple enemies, and so on and so forth. And you can only carry a limited amount of essences in your phylactery. So there's a little bit of a decision to be made what of these passive upgrades you actually want. These weapons, the weapons that you can acquire range from your basic starting pistol to a shotgun to an SMG and to a precision rifle. All weapons can and should be charged to do the most damage. That means you should charge up every shot. And that is also how the game and the game's combat gets a little bit more of a fear factor, because you will probably be charging most of your shots as enemies come stumbling and running towards you. So there's a little bit of a shitting pants moment that might happen. Sadly, the variety of the weapons in this game game is not too high. Most of the other guns that you get throughout the game are they're kind of variations. For example, like the pistol, it has a normal charged version, but the other pistol has a full auto firing mode. That doesn't mean that the upgrades from the normal pistol are also now being applied to the full auto pistol. You will have to upgrade the normal and the full auto pistol separately. The SMG, the same thing. The SMG has a normal full auto mode or a charged mode that fires 3 powerful shots. Both of these weapon types will have to be upgraded separately. And then the shotgun has an alternate version that fires both shotgun barrels at once without a charge, which is actually quite useful, but also needs to be upgraded separately. Due to the limited amount of money you will be making in a run, you will likely also never touch most of the weapons and stick to the base pistol and the shotgun most of the time. In New Game Plus, this is where you could experiment a little bit more, especially when you play on hardcore mode, because that gives you more resources to drop from enemies, which actually doesn't make hardcore mode too difficult because you get way more loot. That also means that you will likely also focus on certain weapons, and full disclosure, at the end of my first run through the game, I have not upgraded any of the weapons, and the only upgrades that I put into a gun was the shotgun. All of it mostly went into the pistol because that is your absolute workhorse weapon, that's most of what you need, and then a little bit into the SMG, and that's it. And then later on in New Game Plus I actually tried the different weapons. Sadly, the game also tends to give you ammunition for weapons that you do not have equipped, which is a little bit annoying, but it never became a burden for me, because most of the excess ammo you can just store in the storage chest. Although I did indeed pick up the SMG at some point in the game, because I had so much ammunition for it that I thought to myself, you know what, I've got so much ammo for the SMG, might as well use it. I would argue the shotgun and the pistol is more than enough to handle most of the enemies. Bonus points in New Game Plus, double-barreled shotgun is quite fun to use. In addition to that, the shotgun has such a massive charge shot that I'm certain that thing can plow straight through concrete walls. So there's yet another reason why some of the keys and the closed doors in this game are a bit bewildering, since the shotgun for sure can blast through most of the obstacles in this game without any issues. But I guess you just have to kind of deal with the gamey feeling and disband your immersion and kind of accept that the protagonist absolutely cannot push past a simple hospital stretcher and can't overcome a simple 2 feet high fence. You also have a fire grenade and an AoE fire blast around you. Both can also be upgraded. Both stun and light enemies up, as well as burn corpses, since monsters can absorb fallen comrades in order to get stronger, and you definitely do not want them to merge. However, if you are a little bit aware of your situation and you will probably handle enemies in combat encounters, it is most certainly almost never going to be the case that you have to deal with merged and powered up enemies. And in addition to that, I almost never burned all the corpses after an encounter, because A, most of the time combat encounters don't take place in the same room twice, and B, if you notice an enemy about to merge, it is extremely visible, it takes a while, and in 90% of all cases you can stun the enemies out of merging with each other. Both the weapon charging and the corpse burning and the corpse merging mechanics are the two unique combat aspects of this game. The rest is fairly standard enemy kiting, weak spot shooting, akin to a very rudimentary third-person survival horror game. The only problem being that the game does not have enough enemy variety, in my opinion, or enemy placements to effectively fill 12 hours of exciting playtime and then still feel interesting by New Game Plus. A lot of the last few levels feel very formulaic and boring, as you will not face any new enemies at that point. In addition to that, only really 3 bosses in this game are not recycled as elite enemies later on, or you're facing the same boss twice, and only 2 encounters really feel like an actual set-piece boss encounter. The game is overall rather easy, with no difficulty options currently present, besides obviously the normal mode and then a hardcore mode for New Game Plus, if you want to do that. Apparently there's an easy mode in development, but I feel as though that's almost not needed. All of my deaths, all of the 6 deaths in my first playthrough came from the final boss. No joke, by the way. And I'm gonna say the final boss is truthfully actually the only interesting challenge in this game. And it's a really cool set-piece encounter. It's probably the most unique combat encounter in the entire game. Unfortunately, the game also auto-saves right in front of the beginning cutscenes before the boss fight, instead of saving at the beginning of the actual boss fight. So if you die, you will have to always skip 2 cutscenes to start the fight. That is a very well-known issue that older games had, and I would not expect that this issue is present in a modern game anymore, but I guess I was proven wrong. And a lot of the game also revolves around trap-filled areas. I'm using trap in quotation marks because it's like environmental hazards. Whether it's exploding pus on the wall, or hanging corpses that try to strangle you, or suicide bomber enemies. And this setup gets repeated again and again and again in this game. At some point it's rather predictable and hardly a challenge to deal with the wall clingers and the exploding pus on the wall, especially since at some point your gun will literally tell you which enemy is still alive and which one is not. And most of the time, let's be honest here, if you hear some weird noise in the room, there's probably a wall hugger present somewhere. And this rather monotonous combat routine starts to kind of drag at a certain point, where all the monsters have been introduced and now the game just throws them at you while stretching out for playtime what it felt like. You will have to repair and restart the tram generators 4 times separately just to progress to the next areas. That feels a little bit like stretching for time. Most of the progression in general is just finding keys to doors and then looping back to a door that was locked before from the other side, and that door then leads back to your save station at the start. So there's some very light FromSoft level design going on here, I guess. And in 90% of all cases, you either search for some sort of progression mechanic, for example, the anti-gravity boots or the 3 toxins in the hospital to crumble down a wall of grown biomass. It's usually, a chase for the key or the key card or some sort of other progression mechanic. The game also has few spooky jump scares here and there. There's a few pretty cheap jump scares with faces making loud noises in front of the screen, in the middle, just pop-up scares, and sometimes monsters bursting through a door. There's not a lot of that in the game, which I for once am glad, because cheap jump scares don't really contribute to a horror atmosphere. It's just cheap tricks. There's some very light tension building and some spooky visions trying to play tricks on you, but I never felt immersed into the horror atmosphere. At least not to the degree that games like Amnesia or the old Dead Space did, or for example the recently released Routine. And that comes mostly down to how combat in this game is usually very well telegraphed, almost to a fault. You always know every time when there's a combat encounter coming up or when you're in a combat arena. It kind of distracts a little bit from the story too, since the story itself is more of a highlight of the game, and if you go through like 12 hours of very predictable combat arenas, it starts to drag a little bit, As I already talked about, the game does a very annoying thing of making every box labeled with yellow paint. Every boarded up door or gap in the wall, there's yellow painted boards, and every jump off point or every climbing spot has like this weird encrusted white stuff on the ledge. I don't even know what that is supposed to be, but yeah, we do have the markings of the hand-holding in modern video games here. I don't know why every single box is painted yellow in this game. And then you can't destroy any other box in the game. It's only yellow boxes that are destructible. Nothing else can be touched. Nothing. Doesn't matter if it's like the most weakest, smallest, insignificant piece of junk wood, you can't smash through it. But every yellow box you can smash without issues. There are also very, very few instances where you can walk off the main path and explore a little extra area, but the game is usually very linear. The most open feeling exploration happens in the hospital, and that place also happens to be the place where you will run past that filing cabinet again and again, which makes it a little bit annoying. Enemies in this game range from the generic melee guys. One is a faster melee guy but less tanky, and the other one is the main zombie type enemy. There are spitter enemies. There are a few stationary enemies like the wall hugger, the pus, and that one exploding crawling enemy that also appears mostly in trap areas. Then there is a spider-like crawling climbing enemies that also shoots spit at you. And then there are thorny enemies. Usually enemies with thorns are the stronger versions of enemies when they have merged. And then there are bigger guys, both normal big guys and thorny big guys and spitting big guys. And then later on, some of them even have armored sections on their body that cannot be penetrated by gunfire. And of course, there's big bosses in the game. Usually there are melee charger type enemies, or there are teleporting enemies who are usually, teleporting into the ground, and then they're popping up right next to a very conveniently placed explosive barrel. The yellow glowing weak spots also make an appearance here too. I mean, you can't have a spooky mass of flesh boss without glowing weak spots. And then that's basically about it. With the exception of the final boss. Again, I don't want to spoil this guy here, but this dude is unique. I feel the game gets mostly carried by the story, some very cool looking set pieces, which, for example, the steel mill, and the very excellent lighting in the game. The game has some obvious secrets too, if you care about collection items and stuff like this, and maybe, if you care about achievements, but that's all I want to say about that one. You just have to find that out for yourself. And that is it for the gameplay so far. It's not terrible, but it's also not excellent. It plays very well, and it plays it itself above average, I would say. It's above average. It's serviceable, but it's a little bit much for a 12-hour campaign. It drags a little bit towards the end. And now we can talk about the story for a little bit. And since I think this story is more of a highlight of this game, I also do not wish to spoil it for you. And yes, that means I won't give you a generic story rundown and call it a lore video to bait in viewers. So in short, let's give you a quick insight. You are a traveler capable of harnessing souls or essence of humans and traversing through time with them. You do so for a mysterious collective and your vocation in order to ascend these souls and add them to said collective. It is also pretty obvious that the travelers are something more, something different. They're definitely not conventional humans. Maybe they're different dimensional beings. There are humanoids, however they're not human. And they are even capable of appreciating some of human culture, but it's very clear that they are not part of humanity. The timeline we are visiting is absolutely ravaged by an almost mythical disease called the Change, where humans started to merge on a global scale, and those who are infected even express a severe sense of loneliness and a wish to be united with others. Therefore, humanity essentially died in this timeline. This fictional Eastern European city this game takes place in is completely overgrown with human tissue and merged corpses and bodies. The only ones seemingly left are the travelers and the orphans. The orphans are the monsters of this game, shambling zombie-like creatures who are not yet merged with the collective. Even those creatures, although they are long dead, still feel the need and the urge to merge with others of their kind. This is how the disease affects even the reanimated matter and tissue. And as you come to expect, during our trips back in time, we come across information that makes us pause and questioning the collective, and possibly questioning our involvement in the outbreak and the history of humanity, as well as some more mysteries that arise the more human essences we acquire. The collective itself gives you targets to extract from time rifts. And we have a tool, the so-called anchor, to go through these rifts in time in order to acquire the essences. Naturally, then you will come to ask many questions. Who might have opened these rifts? And who was meddling in the past? Who might have caused the disease to break out? And again, this story in my eyes is the most interesting part of Cronos, especially some of the lore implications that you learn by going into detail and actually reading the lore in-game. In my opinion, it is the main reason why you should pick up this game. And this is also why I don't want to go through the story here, as if I were to just give you a lore and story rundown, there is basically no reason to play this game. There's also a plethora of lore and storytelling that is completely missable, again, if you don't pay attention to the written things in the game. Just by judging from a single playthrough, it is unlikely that you will fully understand the story. Some people might like that, some people might dislike that. In reading the additional in-game notes, recordings, and going through through New Game Plus, the true scale of the story becomes more fully manifested. Still, you might end up not really knowing what was going on. While there are still mysteries left over to explore with all mystery horror games actually, and there's theories about the change's origin, what the collective truly is, who the traveler is, where they come from, so on and so forth. But is it an insane masterpiece, the likes of which you've never experienced, like some of the YouTubers might want to make you believe? The answer to that is no. No, it's a very competently told mystery story, yes, but if you've read stuff like 12 Monkeys and you know a little bit about time travel stories and you've read some sci-fi books like this, you are not going to be knocked off your chair by figuring out what some of the mysteries in the story allude to. And also, if you're not a fan of From Software like storytelling, you likely won't enjoy how the story is providing its mysteries to you. There's a lot of reading that you have to do if you want to find out what happened. So while the story is better than the gameplay, I would argue we're still talking about a 7 out of 10 versus a 5 out of 10. That does not mean that the gameplay is awful, and that does not mean that the story is excellent. Both have obvious shortcomings, but the story is clearly more interesting and more capably executed, in my opinion. While the gameplay is light, Dead Space-inspired, survival-based, third-person, clunky combat, the story is a time travel mystery with some really, truly existential dread on top of it all. And it's very capably taught to the player. Nothing you ever heard of, and nothing that will completely blast you off your seat once the story concludes, but at least the story is worth the playthrough. Absolutely. And then maybe you can watch the other endings on YouTube, because I don't really think many people will play through New Game Plus for the secret ending. Yes, there are 3 distinctive endings, and I want to talk about them without spoilers, because I think the story falls a bit short at that specific point. Up until the endings, I was rather building up to something nice, but the endings are so abrupt and short, and they're just mystery boxes, besides one ending. The fact that all of these endings are so short after the story did a rather competent setup, it's just a little bit disappointing. And I feel like there could have been a bit more with the after credit scenes and giving the player a few more visual cues. I'm not even wanting the game to just give you a rundown or give you, here's the explanation, this is the true ending, explains it all. No. Just a little bit more visual material would have been nicer, because the game takes the time with its cutscenes. If you don't like long cutscenes, by the way, this game isn't for you. That's just right here, right there. There's some long cutscenes in this game, but it's doing a good job developing the story. But then it cuts it off so abruptly at the end with 3 rather short cutscenes, which is a little bit surprising. I'm just happy that Bloober Team actually managed to write a decent story. It's a competent story, and it didn't end with an obvious self-deletion and some really unfortunate comments about mental illness and some shit. I don't think that Bloober Team did any of their old storytelling on purpose. Like the fact that some of the old Bloober Team stories had really unfortunate endings and the story collapsed in on itself at the end, that wasn't due to malicious actions, I think. They just weren't good at storytelling. So I think having an actual good Bloober Team story here is a step in the right directions. Also, let's be honest here, I can't count Silent Hill 2 because that's a remaster, and that isn't Bloober Team's original story. So this is genuinely a Bloober original game that has a story that is actually the most intriguing part of the game, which is good. So is this actually probably one of the better Bloober original games so far? Yes, I think it is. It definitely is one of the, if you discount Silent Hill 2, of course, it is probably the second best Bloober Team game. If you don't like Bloober, that won't do much for you, I think. But if you want to give this game a chance at a discount, I think I can give this a thumbs up. Stylistically, this game takes place in like a fantasy version of Nowa Huta. It's a district in Krakow in Poland. I don't even know if I said that correctly. A lot of the Eastern European styled buildings and Soviet influence will be found here. It's a style, it's an art style. The art style of this game can be summarized as realism with a bit of time and gravity anomaly and some slight futuristic tech in the game. The futuristic tech is mostly used by the travelers, not by the actual humans. And the rest of the environmental art is semi-realistic buildings like the aforementioned apartment complex, the hospital, and the church grounds, all fit very well into a spooky horror atmosphere and ambience. However, it's also nothing too original. The clock tower in the game is actually the most interesting looking building, and again, I really like the Snowden version of the past, and the one level I think stood out the most is the steel mill. The steel mill with its surreal sky, the massive scale industrial building, and then the addition of the first anti-gravity segments give this area a much more unique feel. There was a really good amount of visual representation there. The music does a good job of setting up scenes as well. The music and the soundtrack is pretty nice as well. But after you've visited the steel mill, it's mostly back to small conventional corridors and courtyards back in the city. And a lot of the game also takes place in the underground tram station with the aforementioned powering up of the many generators. The station acts as kind of your main hub where you return to in between missions. Most of the uniqueness does come from the merged human bodies that grow out of every corner and every building. And of course, the gravity and time anomalies in the game. Suspended gravity always looks cool. I think the dev team still has a way to go, especially when building a game world for actual immersive gameplay. Again, this is only really the second game that Bloober has released with actual action-oriented combat gameplay, so I think we can ease off of them a little bit. The price is pretty steep, and for the price, yes, you can be a little bit more critical. But you know, at least it seems to be going upwards and kind of in the right direction. I highly doubt we'll see a Cronos 2, especially since the sales numbers don't really look too good, and Bloober team also said, for now at least, there is no plans for a sequel. It's also likely that this is probably Bloober team's most competent release to date, a standalone release, and hey, that's something positive. Overall, I think Cronos The New Dawn is a flawed but a very competent little game that kind of overstays its welcome a little bit too much, and it really didn't need to use Unreal Engine 5. And there's a neat story attached to the game, which is the actual highlight. There's some interesting ideas here. Definitely you could, with the Cronos 2, reiterate on some of the strong points of the game, but apparently there's not going to be a Cronos 2, so unfortunate. It's not a masterpiece. It's definitely not a masterpiece. Let's keep the expectations grounded. It is not a masterpiece, but it's also not Unreal Engine 5 slop. All in all, maybe get this one on a discount if you like it. To me, it's fine. It's okay. It's sufficient, but it likely won't stay in anyone's mind for long. It certainly won't make it on any best games of the something list. That's unlikely. And with that, I wish you a good start into the year, a late start into the year, and I will see you next time.